answers all at once. I am one of those skeptical of status quo.
What up? Welcome back to The Grind. My name's Peter Howard at Pierre Howdy on Twitter, senior writer over at Dynasty League Football. How about we talk about something that isn't going to change with the NFL draft, but is actually remarkably important to know about the 2020 season. Everyone wants to put everything on hold until we see what happens in the 2020 draft, right? Anything could change. Well, no, because rookies actually tend to have remarkably little impact on their team. So how about we think about what we can know about teams at this point. It's going to stay remarkably consistent until the 2020 season. Outside of large team firings or hirings at the coaching position, we can know a lot about what we can expect from teams in 2020 season. So what if I was to tell you that the majority of top 24 wide receivers come from teams that are in the top 10 in terms of passing attempts? Not all of them, not necessarily the best wide receivers, especially from a dynasty perspective. You want young breakouts. We want A.J. Brown. He came from the lowest passing teams in 2019, but might be interesting information to know since it's going to remain remarkably consistent and it's not going to change a lot with the 2020 draft. Why not? Because one of the best ways, or the best way I've found of predicting a reasonable expectation for passing attempts year over year is to look through a team and a coaching lens, and those things are probably going to remain pretty stable no matter what happens in the NFL draft. Let's take a look. Alright, so what I've done here is merge my team and coaching history database a little bit along with my NFL database so you can see where the top 24 wide receivers are coming from. I also produced basically counting tab here so you can see where the majority of them come from. Now, interestingly enough, though it's not something I think you can consider particularly utilitarian, it's not of a great deal of use, but since 2009, the most top 24 wide receivers have come from the 10th highest passing attempt team. It's also got the highest rate of having the 10th highest top 24 wide receivers. Now, unfortunately, we can't predict it with such accuracy that I can tell you exactly who's going to be the 10th highest passing attempt offense. But I think I can produce I know I can produce a very good expectation for who is going to be in the top 10 or who is going to be in the top 12. So how does this work without getting too nerdy or too geeky? Well, one thing that you should know is that pass attempts from one year for a team do not very well explain. I didn't say predict because it's not a predictive number. But if you look at the R-squared number year over year for passing attempts, again, since 2009, you actually find only 16% of year 2 being explained by year 1. So these 684 attempts for Atlanta will only explain about 16% of what we can expect from Atlanta in 2020. And that's not a lot, and that's not really what we want. In fact, you can see this a little more broadly. If we look at rank, just, again, simple numbers to keep it easy. And let's pick a team. That's probably the easiest way of doing it. You got a preference? I don't know why I asked. You can't see me. Cincinnati. There you go. So you can see on any particular team level, sorry, I've got to move this over a little bit, that the where they rank in the top 32 changes drastically year over year. So in 2000, where is this? Here. In 2010, Cincinnati was the 5th highest scoring offense. The very next year, it's the 20th. Then it's the 19th. Then it's back up to the 12th, and so on and so forth. And that's the same with every other team. That's what these low numbers are telling us. So even a team like Los Angeles Chargers, for example, I'm thinking of them because of Phillip Rivers. You can see that even with a consistent quarterback, they've been going up and down pretty consistently in terms of passing attempts over the last few years. So what can we do to draw out the utility of team passing data? Well, one of the things we can do is we can look on a year-to-year basis. Again, this is just through this same sample size since 2009. To see the amount of variance on a team level of passing attempts. So that's what this number is right here. It's called the coefficient of variation. Don't overthink it. It's telling you how much the number is changing. The lower the percentage, the less change there is. Essentially, you're dividing the standard deviation by the mean or the average. Don't worry about it. The lower the number, the more similar than their passing attempts are year over year. And I also did this calculation over the last 3 years, so you can see what's been happening more recently, and you can see we can see a lot more variance the smaller the sample size, which is also interesting in and of itself. So not to get too nerdy on it, but when I compare year-over-year numbers, looking on a team level, since most people don't have coaching data, it's actually a little harder to find. But you can get passing attempts from Sports Football Reference or Pro Football Reference very easily. And even looking on a team level, team fairly well explains variance for passing attempts for the next season. If we're trying to predict 2020, which we are, you can expect there to be relatively small variations between 1 year's passing attempts and the next, when we look at a wider sample. Now, what this is telling us is that it doesn't predict, and predict's a bad word, I wasn't meant to use that word, but it doesn't explain the variance very well. But there will be remarkably consistent volume year over year. Why doesn't team explain it? Why don't vacated targets explain it? Because targets, I think we have to start thinking about the player level when we get into how well we're going to perform, and I use that, and that's why my model is, I've largely been a player-focused projector since I started doing it. It's one of the lessons that I continue to take with me from my early understanding. Something I very quickly decided for myself through my own research is that players have a lot to say about how well a team's going to do, a lot more than the team name or the coaching name. I really do think the players on a team have a large effect that way. But we can expect relatively little variance in terms of passing attempts. That's important to know. The other numbers that are also remarkably striking in this instance is if we look at coaching history. Now, I looked through an offensive coordinator and a head coach prism, but I'm just going to show you head coach because, how much time do we really have to worry about a spreadsheet? Or you have. And what we find is that the variance is actually remarkably similar. If we look at the average variance of around 8%, depending on which sample size I choose, and team variance average is around 9%. So it all fluctuates depending on the sample you want to use, or how big or broad or narrow, depending on what you think is relevant. It fluctuates pretty much any way I look at between 7 and 9% through both samples. Now, what I would say is that coaching history gives you a lot better insight in the extremes. Because teams typically, look at the variation between 2019. You've got 600 passing attempts going on for the highest passing team, and then you got, actually this isn't organized that way. Let's look at it this way. You got 684 for Atlanta, and then you got 439 for Baltimore. Despite being such a high-scoring team that year, it didn't produce top 24 wide receivers, and it had a low number of passing attempts. So there is a lot of change in an individual year between which team you're talking about how much they pass, but it's still only a difference of around 200 passing attempts, right? I say only, but the variance is relatively mild. They're all playing 16 games because we're dealing with a 16-game sample here with the same number of minutes. So the variance is significant, but only if you want to understand the extremes of where they're going to fall in this range between 400 and 700 passing attempts, if we want to take the high and low number here, mostly comes down to the coach. So the team history, through my experience, is going to give you a pretty good idea of the average we can expect based on the team's history itself. If you want to predict some of the extremities, then coaching history is very useful. Now, part of the reason is that, again, not to get too lost in this, I don't want to produce an hour-long video on this. I just wanted to give you a quick video with a simple, hopefully you understand it's a relatively good projection of passing attempts next season, and then you've got a list of top 10 teams which are interesting, and I think you'll find some interesting names in there. But anyway, coaches control the run-pass split a lot more than they control targets, and a lot more than they control overall passing numbers. And so when you look at the coaching history, I think we're seeing the variance in the extremes because of that preferred run-pass split that they prefer. I think coaches definitely decide how many plays are going to be rushing plays and how many are going to be passing plays a lot more than the team or the player level. I think that's where they come into play more than anything else, and so that's drastically affecting the overall value. So, again, trying not to get too lost in here. there's some really interesting stuff here. I'm trying to nerd out on too much. But what I'm essentially saying is if we take a weighted average of coaching history from the head coach to the offensive coordinator, and we build in that team average, then you can create, and this is what I use essentially, and it's all my initial understanding of this all came from Justin Freeman, who's a projector. You can find him on Twitter at JustinFreeman22, I think. He's a big DFS player as well as a fantasy football creator, and he's got a free model, and he uses a weighted average for head coach and offensive coordinator to create projections, initial player pools of passing attempts and rushing attempts. And so it's really from his work that I started to build up a history and modify it with my own preferences and what I find in the data and what I think is predictive and so on and so forth. So, it's pretty good. It's not going to be accurate. And again, this goes back to this history. I don't think I can tell you who's going to be the 10th highest passing attempt team next year. If I did, then I would just be telling you to draft all the wide receivers on that team. We're not going to get it that accurately. But we do know, based on when most top 24 wide receivers come from, all over here, that one of the best ways of targeting or trying to find top 24 wide receivers, we're looking where they mostly come from heavily passing heavy offenses, right? Or the teams that are going to pass the most for one reason or another. All right, so this is what all this is saying. I'm using team history and coaching history to create a reasonable expectation for what's going to happen in 2020. I actually modified that on a player level when I feed it into my database, because I think players have a lot to do with how successful you're going to be with that run-pass split. So it does change through my projections, but this is the initial number of passing attempts and rushing attempts that it gives into my model, which then the players then affect from that point on, whether we go over or under that expectation. All right, so here they are. The top 10 passing offenses, according to all that data and all that research going into a simple weighted calculation, is going to be Atlanta, New England, Philadelphia, Carolina, Tampa Bay, New York Giants, Pittsburgh, Kansas City, Green Bay, and, since they're in the news right now, with the Brandon Cooks trade, the Los Angeles Rams. Those are the teams most likely through a team level to produce top 24 wide receivers. Now, most of those teams already have top 24 wide receivers on them, and that's likely why they're also turning up in there. If you feed the idea of similarity into a calculation and say these teams produce a similar number of passing attempts year over year, please weight the average and project or predict 2020's passing attempts, and you should expect to see consistency, because you're telling it that there is consistency, right? So if you check out these top 10, and then we go back to the 2019 season, you'll see a lot of similarity in the top 10 this year compared to last year, compared to the top 10 it's predicting for next year. If anything, it's mostly interesting for the teams that miss it. For example, Dallas has fallen out the top 10 when we take coaching and OC and that similarity score into consideration, and it's put it at the 25th. And again, like we looked, that's not unusual. That happens a lot, and it doesn't mean the players on that team aren't going to be top 24 wide receivers. Plenty of players, top 24 players, without being in top 10 offenses. That's not what I'm saying. Plenty of the best players come from there. AJ Brown came from this sample size, right? But something that's not going to change until the NFL draft is this. It's this basic assumption of how many times teams are going to pass in 2020. And I got to tell you, I do think it's a fairly good projection based on the information we have that is useful and describes variance and explains variance in terms of R-squared numbers. So there it is. I'm trying to. I love discussing this stuff so much. I keep having to remind myself and trying to keep it just a simple. Here's some utilitarian data. Here's why it's utilitarian, because that's my process. Using this weighted average between these three different aspects and showing you past data. But those are the top 10. This calculation predicting going to be the highest scoring teams. Now from there, like my model's going to do, it weights in player success, player ability, player efficiency, the quality of the players on the depth chart, right? So Cooks being gone, I honestly think hurts the Rams. But the coach and the team and the other players on that team over the last 3 years strongly lead us to believe they're going to be a high passing offense without Cooks. But it might hurt their overall efficiency. But there you can see where you start to break that down by the specific context. If we take a broader level view, this is an accurate median expectation of the top 10 teams are going to pass the most times in 2020. Alright, hope that was interesting for you guys. Again, I'm trying not to nerd out too much. I know I got a spreadsheet up and all that stuff. But I'm heavily working on my 2020 projections. They're actually due out. The first run I meant to send out for next week. Just a little more nerding. This is something I've recently started to build into my projection model. I'm now giving out targets based on positional usage. Positional target share is a lot less sticky year over year. Whether you're looking for coaching history or through team level. That's one of my big reasons that I suspect players have a lot more to do with targets, even if coaches and teams and composite of the teams of the last 3 years have a lot to say about passing attempts. I think these shift based on player talent. So when Atlanta, for example, loses Austin Hooper, I think it's going to come a lot closer to the average for the league than they've been over the last 3 years. Now, Atlanta's interesting because Hooper really didn't push the target share of the team or the coach up too much. The average, I believe, for tight end positional targets is about 20%. So they're actually passing to the tight end a lot less, the position a lot less. It's just Hooper was co-opting such a large percentage of those targets, and also he was largely touchdown fueled, right? And so positional target share isn't telling you as much about player target share as we maybe want. But where it is predictive about year over year to about 45, 44%, explains 44% of the number for the next season. I tested it the same way I'm testing this, very basic, to just get an idea of how much it explains. And it is like 44% is significant, but like target share for players in and of itself, if you choose a good sample and go through everything else, it can get up to 66, 75% if we're talking about the right kind of players. So positional target share for a team isn't as useful for predicting players. However, the reason I've built it in is I do think that the loss of Austin Hooper is going to affect this, and where the team has a tendency, and the coaching history has a tendency to target the position a little less than league average, that's not going to be good for the players left on the depth chart. So one of the reasons I built this in is I want to create a reasonable expectation adjustment based on the player count. Now, I haven't, again, there's a lot of variables running in on that, and I haven't quite figured out how to do it, but one of the ways I want to affect team projections through trades is by affecting this positional target split. And now the players' target splits are a lot more predictive for what they're going to do, but I think the team does change year over year based on the players that they have. And again, that seems to be borne out in the data as well. But anyway, I don't want to get you too bored. If you do want to check some of that out, I have this coaching history database available. I have all of this stuff in very neat databases that you can create your own. And if you don't know how, I've got videos on that too, or I'll do it for you, just ask. But all of this type of information is being fueled by this team history database, and I'm just pulling stuff out of it and organizing it in a way that I can visually see, because I'm very visual, I think, what's going on year over year, player over player, team over team, and that gives me a better idea of player situations and what might happen to them when they move teams. And the conclusion I've come to, you can disagree if you dig through it to find something different, is that I think the positional target share of a team like Atlanta losing Hooper will go down, and I don't think any player on that depth chart has shown an ability to create an outsized role from that positional target share themselves. But tight ends is a little more difficult to say that about, where they do take longer to develop, and we haven't seen much of them, the ones that are left on Atlanta, for example, just yet. So it could still happen if you're a truther for one of the guys deep down on that depth chart. I'm not trying to kill it. I was more just talking from a projection standpoint. I think this is the lens that I want to try to affect team projections through positional target share. You lose Hooper, so this is going to go down. It's already below league average. and so on and so forth. Again, even over a 3-year history after losing Gronk, New England still targets the tight end position at or slightly above league average. And one of the things you can see if you're organized by it. Interesting enough, Philadelphia, I wonder why they're so high. Maybe it's because they had 2 top 12 tight ends. Darren Waller last year, and also just Oakland in general since Gruden's taken over, which is one of the positives, was one of the positives in Waller's favor going into 2019, has been this tendency to feature the tight end significantly above league average, which again is around 20%. Over their wide receivers, like the diminishing of Amari Cooper, despite being the highest targeted and the best wide receiver on the depth chart, the position itself was kind of devalued. Now that's where you have to dig into the team situation though, because again, if you've got 47% of the targets going to, and this is a weighted average from the head coach position by the way, it's still okay if your wide receiver co-ops 90 or 40 or 50% like DeAndre Hopkins does of those targets to go to the wide receiver position. And so from there you look at the player again, but instead of looking at their target share for the team, you look at the target share for the position, which again is also, that's how I've built this back into my projection model. I'm no longer looking through a team lens and targets. I'm looking through a position lens and targets, and then their target share of individual players balloons up or down based on the percentage of wide receiver, running back, or tight end targets. But again, I promised I wouldn't nerd out, and then I just went ahead and did it. Anyway, I'm going to get out of here. Hopefully that's interesting to you all. Let me know. Comments or on Twitter at PA Howdy if there's anything else you'd like me to cover. I think we can have a pretty good understanding of who the top 10 most pass-heavy teams are going to be next year, and we already know that. The NFL draft shouldn't change it too drastically. All right. Thanks very much. I will talk to you again next time here on The Grind. Thanks. Bye.